Okay, let's go there. My name is Pedro Lenza. I'm from Brazil, and very happy to be in this third panel, especially because Brazil now we just had our election this last Sunday. I was there. I've been to Brazil on Friday and came back on Sunday after voting. So this is something the theme of this panel is very important for us Brazilians that don't have this gender parity, and they have a rule saying that 30% of the women should be in the election, but they don't have things that would be like 50%, real 50%. And in this election, especially because of some words of Bolsonaro that was elected, there is a movement there saying that we should have 50 and 50%. There's also an organization, I think it's Brazil 55th, and they are trying to become this true. So let's see. So that's something very interesting for us, for Brazilian, for our Latin American people. And I'm very proud to be here as a chair of this panel. So I'd like to thank so much Daniela Urosa for this opportunity, and also congratulate for this very important international conference. And I would like to say thank you for our speakers of this night, Mona, Lena Krug, Betilde Munhoz Pogosian, and Carmen Alanis are going to talk. We have the keynote address. Mona is going to talk about, start the presentation, then you're going to have Carmen, and afterwards Betilde. I would like to introduce Mona to everybody. Already she's well known, very important professor in this field, and she's professor of political science and chair of the Women and Politics PhD program at Rutgers University. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2005 and has written widely on the diffusion and implementation of electoral quotas for women. Her first book, Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, Oxford University, received the American Political Science Association 2010 Victoria Sack Award for the best book on women and politics. She recently completed a multi-year project on the impact of quotas on democracy and gender equality, involving fieldwork and data collection across 9 countries: Western Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, funded by a faculty early career development award from the National Science Foundation. Her current work focuses on violence and harassment against politically active women. Since 2015, she has collaborated with the National Democrat Institute on its #NotTheCost campaign to stop violence against women in politics. She was recently named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow 2017-2019 to research and write an academic book on this topic, featuring testimonies from women around the world. So I would like to welcome everybody, Mona Lena Krug. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak at this conference. And what I was going to do in my talk was to try to pick up some of the themes that we've been discussing and into a new direction, which is to look at some of the gendered challenges to electoral integrity in Latin America. So my remarks are going to be informed by some of my, my past research, but also some of my ongoing projects related to women's political representation worldwide. So I always like to start by setting the context with some data on the current status of women in politics around the world, and specifically in terms of the dramatic shifts we've seen in recent years in terms of women's parliamentary representation. So as you can see from this graph, which comes from a publication by the Interparliamentary Union, which is the International Organization of Parliaments, compares women's parliamentary representation in 1995, which is when the UN Fourth World Conference on Women established gender-balanced decision-making as a goal for countries to strive towards, and 2017 in terms of the progress, looking at the progress that had been made over the past 20 years. So what we see from this figure is that the world average itself has more than doubled in a very short period of time. And this is a pattern we see replicated across every single region of the world. So in some regions, the factor of increase has been 4 or 5 times the level it was in 1995. For example, if you look at the Arab states, from about 4% to about 18% in just those short 20 years. You'll also see that the Americas currently lead all other regions of the world in terms of women's parliamentary representation. So this is really a region where I think there's a lot of interest globally to understand how that change has been possible. So of course the major driver I'm going to argue behind these changes globally and also in Latin America has been the rapid and widespread diffusion of electoral gender quotas, almost all of which have been adopted after 1995. Currently, there's more than 130 countries that have some form of electoral gender quota, whether that is a legislative quota that applies to all political parties, reserved seats, which is about setting aside seats for women in elected bodies, or political party quotas, which are adopted voluntarily by individual political parties. So this is obviously the subject of my first book, and I've included here a map from the Quota Project, which is a project between Stockholm University and International IDEA. And I think one of the really fascinating things we can see from this map is that there are some regional patterns in terms of quota introduction. And particularly in Latin America, almost every single country in the region has some form of gender quota. And almost all of that involves a legislative quota policy. And so this is, the most, in theory, the most powerful quota measure, and it's pretty universally adopted across the Americas. Another thing that makes Latin America a very interesting region to study is that it's been further distinguished by reforms that have tried to extend and deepen those quota requirements, most notably by increasing them from 30%, usually that was the focus of the quota law in the 1990s, to increase it to 50%, or gender parity. So at last count, 8 countries, so Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, most recently Argentina, have improved their quotas to gender parity. But what we can see from the map is that not all of these measures have been equally effective. And really not surprisingly, those that have weaker provisions, those that permit certain loopholes to implementation, tend to result in fewer women elected. So it's not just about quotas, but it's also obviously about quota design and how they're written in ways that compel full quota adoption. So what this means is sort of variability. Although there's almost all countries with quotas, those variations means that there's actually quite large differences across countries in terms of the actual numbers of women elected. And so this, of course, shows us that that quotas don't all entail the same transformations. But what I want to focus on in my remarks is that even in countries where we've seen major changes, like Bolivia, we still have other barriers to women's full political participation. So what I want to really do in my remarks is to focus on the bottom country on this list, Brazil, as well as Bolivia, just to make this case about some of the challenges, gender challenges to electoral integrity, what we can see through looking at women's political representation. Before I do that, though, I think it's worth taking a moment to recognize that the challenges that I'm going to speak about don't, I say this, merely concern women and the achievement of gender equality, although, of course, that would be an important reason alone itself. But I want to highlight that these developments that I'm going to talk about also pose a very fundamental challenge to democracy, undermining women's political and human rights. Okay, so the first gender challenge to electoral integrity involves the many efforts we see in Latin America, as well as other places around the world, to subvert gender quota provisions, not only to make a mockery of the laws, but also, of course, to render them ineffective in challenging male political domination. So in my many years studying gender quotas, I've been always struck by the variety and creativity of strategies to resist quota implementation. So in an article I published a few years ago, I mapped these dynamics of resistance, as well as some strategies for overcoming these challenges. So a lot of the examples, my examples in that article try to come from all regions of the world, but I think some of the most vivid and interesting examples come from Latin America. So this is a table from the article which maps the forms that resistance can take before, during, and after elections. And in the presentation, I'm really going to focus on resistance that occurs in those last two stages, during elections and after elections have taken place, which most clearly pose challenges to electoral integrity. Okay, so look at the case of Brazil. I think this is probably the most interesting case in terms of subverting gender quotas. Of course, it's not the only one, but I think it's a very striking case. So Brazil was part of the initial wave of countries in the region that first adopted gender quotas in the late 1990s, with a law that was passed in 1997 stating that parties must reserve 30% of their spots on their list to women. At the same time, the reform increased the number of candidates that parties can nominate from 120% of the number of seats available to 150%. So what this means is that if there were 10 seats available, previously they could nominate 12 candidates, now they can nominate 15. And what happened was that parties read the word reserve in a very deliberately minimalistic way. And they said, well, we could still nominate 11 men and no women, and we're still in compliance with the law. Because we reserved those seats for women, we just didn't fill them. All right, so, and this was something that was defended ardently by party lawyers, right? People with very, obviously strong legal skills. So as a result, we see actually a decrease in the number of women elected in 1998 as compared to the previous elections. So this led, obviously, to great dissatisfaction on the part of quota advocates. And in 2009, they achieved what has been called the mini-reform to the electoral law that changed the wording to say that parties must fill 30% of their slots on their electoral list with women. And this was accompanied by some mandates from the Electoral Court, which said that 10% of parties' broadcast time had to be devoted to promoting women's political participation. So that wasn't really clear if that meant actually putting female candidates or if it was about getting women to vote. But anyways, 10% of the free time allocated by the state, as well as 5% of parties' campaign funds had to, again, be devoted to promoting women's political participation. Before the last elections, both of these mandates were increased to 30%. So it's pretty significant change in the last election. Okay, so what does this look like? What's been the impact? So this is a graph that compares, so the red is the percentage of women elected to the Chamber of Deputies, right, the lower house of Parliament. And the blue line is the share of women among the candidates. So you can see that all the time there have been more women nominated than elected, but the gap between these takes off after that so-called mini reform, after 2009. So what parties were doing was nominating more women, but not electing any more women than before. And in fact, the share of women elected in 2002, 2006, and 2010 was exactly the same, 8.6%. It never changed. What you see in the last election is a slight increase the number of women elected, and we don't have, since it's so recent, some analyses, but it's possible that the 30% regulations may be having some sort of impact. But there's still a very, very large gap. About 15% of those elected are women, and 30% of those nominated are women. Okay, so what's going on, to explain this gap? So it's been increasingly clear since the mini reform that now that parties, in fact, are obligated to nominate women, that they're finding other ways to avoid actually electing women. And the biggest problem in this regard has been what people call fake candidates, or the candidatas laranjas, the orange candidates. And so there's been some debate about, well, everyone knows that parties are nominating fake candidates, but how can we identify that these are actually fake candidates, right, who are just nominated to fulfill the quota, but they aren't actually credible. So this is one graphic that was developed, an analysis that took the data from the Electoral Tribunal to say, well, how many candidates spent no money, didn't campaign at all, and received no votes in the election. And what we see in 2010, so on the left is the federal and the state elections, is that there is an increase in the number of candidates that spend no money on their campaign and receive no votes. But it's a huge difference between men and women. It's like a factor of 4 or 5 times, right? So 49 of those were women and 10 of them were men in 2010. 82 of them were women, 24 were men in 2014. Right, so it suggests that there's a lot of these fake candidates that are being put forward by political parties. On the right-hand side, this is just the same data for local elections. It's very, very similar pattern, right? So this is, not just that they didn't have a serious campaign; they didn't campaign at all. It's pretty clear from that data. So how does this relate to electoral integrity? Okay, well, I think some people will say that these sorts of tricks are already built into lawmaking in Latin America, right? Which is this saying that I think has come up in every single interview and every single presentation I've made about gender quotas in Latin America. But I also think that we need to start denormalizing this type of behavior, pointing out that what we're talking about is not just like tricks, but it's also about electoral fraud. And so this is, I think, a wonderful graphic, right, that says behind every fake candidate is a fraud committed by a political party. And I think it's really, really important to start thinking about it in these terms. And of course, this is not a problem exclusive to Brazil. This is just one of the cases where it's clearest to operationalize it and prove it. And so I think this is something we really want to bring into our discussions about electoral integrity, as well as obviously thinking about gender equality in elections. Okay, so the second challenge that I want to talk about concerns what global actors are calling violence against women in politics. But in Latin America, this is a phenomenon that's more commonly known as political violence and harassment against women. So these are behaviors that seek to undermine women's candidacies during elections and to pressure them to leave office after they've been elected. So just to understand how this problem differs from other forms of political and electoral violence, I'm just including here in this slide the definition given by the National Democratic Institute, which explains that political violence can be experienced by anyone and affects and is directed at people of all genders, but the specific issue of violence against women in politics has 3 distinct characteristics. It targets women because of their gender, its very form can be gendered, and its impact is to discourage women in particular from being or becoming politically active. Right, so violence against women in politics differs in that it's specifically about targeting and disenfranchising women in the political process, but systematically violating their political and human rights. So this is a concept that's currently receiving a lot of global attention. Just in the last couple of weeks, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women presented a report to the UN General Assembly on violence against women in politics, just to give you an example of that. But the debates are, very interestingly, most developed in Latin America, and this has been the subject of some of the work I've done together with my former graduate student, Juliana Restrepo-Sanin, where in the first article, we tried to map the debates, the different proposals, and in the second piece, we tried to defend the concept against critiques that it's really just a subset of political violence. We want to say this is actually different than just political violence applied to women. This is something quite analytically distinct. So the country where this debate has gone the furthest is Bolivia. It's followed by Mexico, but we'll hear more about that in a moment, which is the first country in the world to pass a law to criminalize political violence and harassment against women. And the inspiration for the legal reform originated in the experiences of locally elected women, particularly from rural areas, who faced a series of pressures to resign their post after they'd been elected. For example, through physical violence and sexual assaults, various forms of economic coercion, like withholding their salaries. And the final catalyst for the law was the murder of Juana Quispe, who was a locally elected woman. She's also an indigenous woman who'd been the focus of escalating attacks over the course of several years before she was finally murdered. And although everyone locally knows exactly who was behind her killing, that person has never been held accountable for that crime. But it's really important to point out that Quispe is not an outlier. Her experiences are echoed in violence and harassment faced by other elected women in Bolivia as well. The network of locally elected women in Bolivia, called ACOBOL, has been very active in theorizing and collecting data on this problem. So I've just clipped one of their, some information from one of their studies, which just shows you exactly how widespread this phenomenon is. So this is looking at locally elected women. They found that more than half, nearly 60%, had experienced political violence and harassment. But of these, only about a quarter had filed a report. So it still remains significantly widely experienced, but widely underreported as a crime. So some examples of political violence and harassment are on the right, include things like restricting women's opportunity to speak, preventing them from participating in committees, and forcing them to sign documents against their will, right? Which is, of course, about interfering in the political process and about interfering with their political rights. This is not a problem just restricted to Bolivia. So in addition to the Bolivian law, we have other countries in the region that have proposed similar bills. This is a slightly more detailed graph that comes from Juliana's recent doctoral dissertation on violence against women in politics in Latin America. So we see that it's something that is coming to a number of countries, very recently proposed. There's some variations in terms of how they define, identify different types of violence, but there's some shared features across all of these. I think one of the most important points of difference is some of these are standalone laws and others are attempts to reform the existing electoral laws or laws on violence against women. And there's growing consciousness across the region that political violence and harassment against women is a serious problem. So we've seen actions, for example, from the Inter-American Commission of Women, as well as from Parlamericas, which is, of course, the network of legislators across the region. So just to move towards a conclusion, I want to contrast these developments with existing approaches to understanding electoral integrity. And of course, this is from the Electoral Integrity Project's website. And gender has been brought to some degree into some of these existing categories, but I want to argue that it remains largely unrealized as it's underappreciated as a serious problem that we really need to think about very carefully when we talk about electoral integrity. And it's absolutely vital to remember, I want to argue, that women are, of course, half the population and have political rights that we need to value and protect. And this includes ensuring that quotas aren't deliberately and openly undermined so that women, in fact, have equal opportunities to participate. It also requires that political violence and harassment aren't normalized, but rather addressed so that women and men can participate fully and equally in politics without fears of violence. Right, so thank you very much. Just switch. Is it this one here?
Thank you.
Oops, sorry. Doing this.
Oh, Daniela. Does anybody know the password of the computer? Did it? Oh.
Don't tell her that I know the password.
So Ignacio knows your password.
Harvard solved the problem.
Your PowerPoint is there?
Not guilty.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Mona, for your wonderful presentation, and especially talking about Brazil. It's a big challenge we have over there. And now I would like to present Professor Carmen Alanis. It's a pleasure to have you here. Professor Carmen is a Mexican woman and Juris Doctor until November, until November 2016. She was Justice of the Federal Electoral Court, and from 2007 to 2011, the first woman Chief Justice of the Electoral Court. She was the representative of Mexico to the follow-up mechanism of the Belém do Pará Convention on the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence against women. And the former Mexican representative to the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. From April 1st, she is the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National University of Mexico in Boston, visiting scholar at Harvard Law School 2017-2019, and member of the Electoral Integrity Initiative of Kofi Annan Foundation. Her specialization focuses on electoral integrity, rule of law, access to justice, gender parity and equality, political violence against women, and indigenous women representation. So I'd like to welcome everybody. Professor Carmen, thank you so much.
Yes, please.
Okay, wonderful. Excuse me.
Well, I'm studying all that. I'm not an expert on that. Thank you very much. I have lots of material, and actually Mona has already presented some of my graphics. So I will go very fast in order to comply the timing. Thank you very much, Daniela and the Clough Center, for inviting me. And I love to participate in this table. Oh, something's happening here. Okay. First of all, I want to stress on the second paragraph. It's a Kofi Annan statement. He says that in Latin America, he believes that democracy, as I think all of us is the political system best suited to manage our changing world. But he asked us to think about dangers to democratic ideals and institutions that are in evidence around the world, including Latin America. So think about and create solutions in Latin America. And I think, and I completely agree that electoral integrity and gender parity, on the one hand, we have very good news. We are increasing our representation in political spheres, but on the other hand, we are facing backlashes as political violence. So taking full account of gender throughout the electoral processes implies arrangements that guarantee women's right to vote and to be elected, but this is not enough. So we have to do something else, and I think it's a new social contract that we have to build up together, women and men. I found two specific indicators to talk about gender parity and electoral integrity, and I will focus on substantive equality. But it's the level of democratic parity, we have to measure that, and also the incidence of violence against women in politics. We have to also measure that. So we are talking about inclusion, women's inclusion, but not only during the electoral cycle. It's the permanent inclusion in the political and public sphere. So it's at every stage of the electoral process, but also in government, in the composition of electoral authorities as well, and sorry, I have a typo there, and in political parties. We have to work on mechanisms that enhance representation for women, including inside political parties. And also, political parties have to adopt democratic procedures to ensure equal participation of men and women, but not only as candidates. The parties' structures have to be impact with the presence of women. And I mentioned, as Lina, violence against women in politics. So the obstacles. Number of elected women does not guarantee gender equity. And also it doesn't guarantee that these women in the decision-taking spaces are going to be promoting women's equity, and also they don't guarantee that women will automatically be empowered. So we have to take that into account as well. We have to keep working with all women that are participating in politics. It cannot be assumed that politics will be performed differently. So not because we are there, from night to day it changed everything. No, it's becoming actually more difficult. I think, and I'm convinced that the specialized bodies such as the electoral authorities, when we talk about gender parity or gender equality, automatically we have to think about human rights, and we don't do so. We are talking about human rights and about the protection of human rights. Political rights are human rights, and unfortunately in some spheres they are still discussing about this, if political rights are human rights. Of course they are human rights. So if we consider political rights, we assume, all of us here, that these are human rights, but not all of them outside. So if we assume that political rights and women's political rights are human rights, so the principle of equality and the exercise of these rights are going to be protected. And also then we can create and design specific obligations to protect these political rights as human rights. The role of international treaties and conventions are the most effective in regulating the interaction of the strong with the vulnerable and are necessary condition for equality. So I'm entering to the constitutional perspective that Daniela asked me to talk about during this gender parity and constitutional democracy. So I won't stop here on gender theory, but never forget that women have been excluded because a cultural construction. It's not because a biological or physical difference between men and women. It was a cultural construction, so it is good because we can change that, okay? So let's see this graphic. You can see here the material exclusion of women in politics. When was the formal recognition accepted in the world for the right to vote? So, I mean, we started in Europe at the end of 19th century, and the last one, 2015, in Saudi Arabia. No? So we are still working on the formal recognition of the right to vote and be elected of women. So this is a fact. This is a fact, and it's a figure. So it was until the post-war period, with the creation of the International Human Rights Law, when this started to change. We found the substantial change with the international treaties and the preparation of democratic laws. So I won't go very deep, but we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the Convention on Political Rights of Women, 1954, and these international treaties related to human rights, the protection of human rights, established the basis for the recognition and respect of human rights. In the Americas, we were more effective than in Europe. The OAS Charter in 1948 and the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man and the American Convention recognize the right of individuals to not suffer discrimination by the state, but the most important step that these treaties put on the side of international law is that responsibilities of states. So it was very important because these international conventions created or provoked a wave of countries to recognize the right to vote of women. The second generation of international treaties were specific. They took specific actions in favor of equality, the right to active suffrage, and the right to passive suffrage. But we are talking about formal recognition. So the apparent equity in the norm was insufficient. So what we needed is to break barriers. So we have to change from formal recognition to equality, to substantive or material equality. So why do I insist of this difference between formal recognition and material or substantive equality? Because nowadays, 172 constitutions of the world explicitly explicitly mentioned that there is equality between men and women, and that all of us are eligible to be vote. But that's formal equality. These numbers illustrate that the formal equality is not enough to eradicate social and political inequalities. Around the world, women in politics are 6% head of states, 5% head of government, 23 or 24% national parliamentarians, 18% ministers, and judges, I didn't put it here, it's 27%, which is the highest figure. It's impressive. Yeah. Well, what's going on there? Well, okay. So substantive equality, it means that the states have to do and to take all measures to make it real, to make equality real, to take all measures needed to not only recognize the rights, but to guarantee the plenty exercise of political rights. And then we have the sacred books for gender parity. It's the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, approved in 1979. The first international instrument that defined affirmative actions in favor of women and as temporary special measures. And its Article 7 obliges states to take, and I will read it, all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the political and public life of the country, and in particular ensure to women on equal terms with men the right to participate in policy making. So if any state is a party state of this convention, this is the only statute necessary to protect women's rights in that country. They don't need the Constitution, they don't need the law. They can go from this international treaty to the direct protection of the exercise of women's rights. And I mention this as a strategy. In some Latin American countries, we didn't have the obligation in constitutions or in electoral laws to work with quotas or to interpret in favor of women's rights. So we used as international law-based, the international treaties. Of course, the state has to be a party state of the convention. The regional convention is Belém do Pará. This is an avant-garde instrument which established or aimed the prevention, punishment, and eradication of gender violence in the Americas. It defines different types of violence, and also this kind of types of violence includes physical, sexual, psychological, until then underestimated. So it's the first regional instrument which establishes different types of violence, and adopted the requirement of a series of state-led actions to achieve the full implementation of this treaty. And also, this is the first regional instrument which places political rights within their protected rights. So it's the first instrument that considers women's political rights to be protected, and also establishes that the states have to work on the eradication of stereotypes against women. And the last one is the Istanbul Convention. Council of Europe adopted this convention 20 years after the Belém do Pará. not explicitly include political participation, but the Istanbul Convention recognizes Belém do Pará Convention, which is a very good thing, talking about international treaties, and also recognizes the rulings of the Inter-American Court and Commission of Human Rights related to gender violence. So affirmative actions are recognized, and states are compulsory create and develop affirmative actions, if necessary, as temporary measures to protect the exercise of women's rights. So affirmative actions for gender candidacies are temporary measures supported by international treaties that are not established in law, in national laws, or in administrative measures just because they like it. It's because international treaties oblige the states to take these temporary measures. So the first country which established an affirmative action for gender quota was Argentina in 1991. Brenda is like cheering. And that was the moment when the real process of incorporating women in the decision-making public sphere started or began in Latin America. Mona just showed you this graphic. It's very interesting, and it shows you that quotas work. And also she mentioned the 8 countries that have already parity in law. And the only 2 differences between Panama and Honduras, with the other countries is that they establish quotas, but inside political parties' procedures. So the role of the courts in Latin America are very important about the interpretation of the international treaties, the national laws, and what political parties are doing to avoid these measures. We are very creative. No? Mona also mentioned some examples. So these quotas or affirmative actions generates resistance still. So they represented a provocation in the way of understanding equality in political competition. So opposition, you guess who were opposition, criticized quota and still, I mean, it's men and women. I have discussed a lot with women that feels that quotas diminish their capability and background of being elected the same way as men. So they criticized quotas, considering them as inversely discriminatory. So if you gave more possibilities to women to be registered or have a percentage in the parliament, so it's discriminatory against men. That's one position. And others questions them as a restriction imposed on the freedom of citizens. So, I mean, that's impossible, because if you don't want to vote for a woman, you vote for a man, but you are free to vote for whoever you want. So it's the other position. But little by little, quotas have been rooted in the world. And we actually have an international standard which established, and this is very important if we are thinking about constitutional reforms. The Venice Commission included in its Code of Good Practices in electoral matters the legal rules that to impose a minimum percentage of persons of each sex among the candidates, if they have a constitutional basis, they should not be considered contrary to the principle of equality of suffrage. So if you have the affirmative action of the temporary measure in the Constitution, so it has the same level as other principles that protect human rights and are established in the Constitution. So no one could argue that a quota or an affirmative action is unconstitutional. And this is a standard. It's an European standard, but what are they telling us? Establish the affirmative action in the Constitution. For the Americans, this is crazy because you never reformed your Constitution. And in Mexico, we have how many reforms, Consul Rabasa, we have in our Constitution? 600 amendments in our Constitution. But it's a way of assuring the constitutional control and protection of political rights. So I wanted just to mention 4 elements that for me are necessary. No exceptions, because what we are facing is that exceptions are included in laws. So in a parliament, they establish a quota or parity, but if the party don't find women, no, or if the women's office of the party, or if the electoral authority, so they permit not to achieve or the quota or parity. So exceptions, political parties will use them, for sure. So we have an emblematic ruling in Mexico, sentence 12624, that's why I use that, which obliged political parties to comply the quota. Even there was an exception in law. So the exception in law was that if the candidacies were democratically defined inside the party, they were not obliged to comply the quota. But the electoral authority gave them the possibilities and which democratic procedures they would accept to avoid complying the quota. So we declared that unconstitutional, unconventional, it was against international treaties, and we obliged political parties to comply in that time the quota. They went all together, parties that you never saw them together, the president of the parties, before the court. I was the only woman magistrate. That day I was not there, of course. They were all together holding hands to talk to the justices and said, we don't find women. We don't have enough women to register them as candidates. So they had to comply, and we told them, if you don't register, registry 4060, we cancel your candidacies, all of them. So no exceptions in law. Sanctions, strict sanctions. So if they prefer to pay a fine instead of complying quota or parity, they will pay a fine. So no, you don't register their candidacies, or you cancel their registry or their participation in that election. And also, the substitutes has to be same sex. No, the opposite. We have had terrible experiences in Mexico that they oblige women to resign, and the substitute is a male and become the representative. Now, in law, it's the same gender formula, okay? So if you resign, your substitute is the same sex, okay? And of course, access to justice. Access to justice, for me, it's the most important issue that we have to work on. Because all this is perfect. We have parity in constitution, we oblige parties, we have jurisprudence, we have great rulings, but if they don't comply all this, what happens? So we have to create and model a system that gives women access to justice and to be immediately redressed. So all what we reviewed and talk about is enough? The answer is no, it's not enough. So in Latin America, and this is a Latin American seminar, we have very strong electoral institutions and courts. When I mention rulings of the Latin American electoral courts in Europe or here in the United States, sometimes they don't understand what are we doing in our countries. So access to justice and the role of electoral courts in Latin America are the most important part of all this. So we have to, the great challenges is to bring justice to women, to make their rights be enforced, and to model institutions capable of judging with a gender perspective. Mona Lina already mentioned the backlash that we are facing as a system and as women and as male. It's political violence or violence against women in politics. So that's what we have to work immediately on, and to create and to design this model of access to justice for these cases. And I finish here. Thank you very much.
Do you have any presentation? You do? Let's prepare. Do you know? Okay, let's continue here. Professor Carmen, thank you so much for your presentation. It's a shame we have to stop because I would stay here for hours. Thank you. Congratulations on, like very much. And talking about amendments, I think most of you might know, in Brazil, we are in our 7th constitution that has been amended 99 times. So it's great. So for us, it would be very easy to the amendment. And they are saying that in the next president, because he has the majority of the parliament, we're going to have a lot of... Yeah, so something, it's 30 years, our last constitution, the democratic one. So now we thank you so much for your presentation and for being very strict on the time. I would give you more 5 minutes, but okay. And now we have Professor Betiud. She's the director of the Department of Social Inclusion of the Organization of American States. She has PhD in political science from Florida International University, Miami, and a master's in international relations from the University of South Florida. She has conducted research and published various contributions on issues of democracy, dialogue, and conflict resolution, and the political participation of women, among other topics. More recently, her focus has been on issues of social inclusion and equity in the Americas. Some of her recent publications include the book Women, Politics, and Democracy in Latin America, published by Palgrave Macmillan, New York, in January 2017, and the book Equity and Social Inclusion, Overcoming Inequalities Towards More Inclusive Societies, published by the OAS in 2017 as well. Dr. Munoz Pogosia is also a judge of the Intercultural Innovation Award of the United Nations Organization and the BMW Group, and a member of UN Women Reference Group to evaluate the strategy for promoting women's leadership and political representation at the global level. In 2008 and again 2016, she received the Outstanding Performance Award of the OAS General Secretariat in recognition of her extraordinary performance and contributions to the institution. So I'd like to welcome everybody. Professor Bethilde, thank you so much for coming. Here? Okay.
Hi, everyone. I have the luck of keeping your attention for the last presentation when you're all tired. So I'll try to be very succinct and effective communicating what I brought for you today. So, but first of all, I want to thank the Clough Center for the invitation, and especially Daniela is not here, but Dr. Urrosa for convening this conference, and also and especially for positioning the Latin American research agenda and discussions that are happening in the region within the agenda of the center. So that's something that I wanted to recognize. What I bring to you today is a current project, research project that I'm carrying out with a colleague and a good friend from UNAM, la Universidad Autónoma Nacional de México, Flavia Freidenberg, specifically looking at one question that puzzles me and that I've always had an interest in getting some answers, which is how women, political women, female candidates find money for their campaigns. And you know, when you look at elections and the definition of what is a democratic elections, we always talk about competitiveness, and competitiveness assessed by the right to run, but also and especially by the conditions that candidates have to conduct, to share their message and to get votes from the electorate on a equal or relatively equal level playing field. And one of the issues, as I said, is very interesting to me is the issue of political, or the systems of political financing. And the research and most of the literature tends to focus on two key principles of political financing systems: equity and transparency. And the one that we're using as a conceptual framework for the project that we are conducting is the area of equity, specifically looking at whether public or versus private financing, and a bunch of other questions that I'm going to share with you now can help give us some answers in terms of how women access money. So a very brief outline, and I'll try to be as effective and quick as possible so that we can have some time for dialogue. For the presentation, what is the problem? What are the legal frameworks in the region saying in terms of targeted political financing, which is the baseline for us from which to start? What is the scope of the literature, specifically looking at the one in Latin America? Some baseline explanatory factors that we are hoping to see whether they help explain how women access money at the regional level. And then I'm going to just share some of the, we've already compiled 2 papers based on the data that we've collected, and they're still ongoing and in construction, so I'm very open also to feedback. So I'll share with you the purpose of the project, some preliminary findings, and what is the data saying in terms of obstacles, and trying to translate these into reforms, and what could be some potential reforms. And in this regard, I want to say my colleague, Dr. Freidenberg, is an academic and is, as I said, in a university environment. I come from the more practitioner's side of the equation. So I think what we're trying to do with the project is to give it those 2 flavors, having solid academic findings and research, but also how this could be applied and how can it inform reforms that are actually happening at the political level. So in the book that was mentioned, and that we happen to be so lucky to have Mona Lina and Carmen with chapters in the book Women, Politics, and Democracy, published by Palgrave, we talk about 3 ceilings that impede or become obstacles for women's more substantial representation in politics. The glass ceilings, which is the ones that we always hear about, right? Those limitations that impede women from having the leadership of the Finance Commission or the leadership of the party. If we talk about political parties, cement ceilings, which are self-imposed limitations that women have in terms of moving or transitioning from militants of a party to the candidates within the party. And then the money ceilings, which is something that's been in the literature, a little bit on the literature, but it's been more discussed in the actual practitioner side, which is how women money or the access or not having access to money becomes an obstacle for women to access politics. So the problem, and this is something that also motivated us to do the project, is that anecdotal evidence, interviews, and testimonies from women, and there's one which I don't mention, I didn't include here, one survey by Julie Bollington on the issue of how women access money. From all this evidence that we've already collected and some papers that we've reviewed, female candidates continue to assert that they have difficulty finding money from within the party and from the private sector when they do politics. And then the second issue that's also motivating this research is that the issue of targeted political financing measures tends to be absent from most of the reforms that are happening at the regional level. And if we look at the electoral legislation in Latin America, specifically addressing targeted political financing, we only have, these countries, this group of countries that have included some measure, some form of targeted political financing, be it direct via funding given to the candidacy for the campaign, or indirect by allowing or granting time in the media for the female candidates to share their message. For instance, Brazil has included some form of direct financing, but it was the first one to include indirect political financing, allowing female candidates to use the party media, time in the media to share their message. I heard you saying that it went up to 30%, or maybe, yes. So this is, I have to update that. In the case of Chile, in the last reform, they have the possibility of using public financing for the training of candidates, but they included for the first time giving extra funding to political parties that managed to get women elected in Congress. And then in the case of Colombia, you have similar measures. In the interest of time and to be more effective and leave time for conversation, I will not go into detail. But I will just mention from the ones that we have here, in the case of Costa Rica, that apart from the targeted financing for the training of female candidates, has also adopted the creation of a joint fund for the promotion of democratic values that include both training for both men and women, including the issue of equality. And then the reform adopted in Mexico that was mentioned earlier, which is using 3% of the public financing to the parties for the promotion of women's leadership. And we are also problematizando, how do you say that in English? Problematizing? Do you say that? We are actually questioning this whole issue of why the public funding for parties for training only goes to women, because it's already putting women in a disadvantage in a way, because why don't we train the men? Do I ask the same questions about men's leadership? Pero bueno, that's another question. So just to summarize the legislation that we find in the region, we have 4 groups. The first group, those that have disposed of direct public financing for training and strengthening of women's leadership, and this is Mexico, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Brazil, and Colombia. A second group that has indirect public financing to promote female candidates in the media, and this only includes Brazil. As I said, they were the first one to adopt it, and hopefully this is a reform that can be considered for the future. A third one, which includes Colombia and Chile, which refer to financial incentives to the parties that managed to get female candidates elected, and in the case of Colombia, it includes also indigenous and other vulnerable groups. And then finally, the fourth group, the direct public financing for specific public policies on equality and inclusion, which include the case of Costa Rica with this fund that I mentioned earlier, they have adopted. If we look also at the literature, and this is also why we think that our research is going to contribute to what's being said in the literature in Latin America, we have a lot of research on assessing the benefits of public versus private financing systems. We found that, from the work of Sobato and Casa Zamora, which are kind of like the reference authors on the issue of public versus private campaign financing. We also have some work on how to control or monitor the money coming in and out of the campaigns. We also have interesting research, Sovato also included here, on regulations regarding mass media, transparency in campaign financing, and fiscalization. And then the last group, which is the one where we are hoping to also contribute, is some papers that have been published and somewhat disseminated on equity and electoral competitiveness, taking a look specifically at the case of targeted funding for women, and this includes the working on Mexico by Estrada Ruiz, Casa Zamora and Falguera, Pomares in Argentina, that is also one of the key thinkers on the issue of techos de billetes. You know, she's one of the ones who starts to talk about this. And of course, Delia Ferreira from Transparency International, that's actually, she's one of the has done the leading work on targeted public financing in order to guarantee competitiveness, as well as she also takes a look at the issues of transparency regarding women's access to funding. So in terms of the baseline explanatory factors for what we are starting with, which is that women have a differentiated access to money when running their campaigns. The first one is the issue of women's income inequality with respect to men, as we say, which makes it more difficult for women to have the funding, or at least the seed funding, to finance their candidacies and even the registration costs. Some data on women's unemployment rates is usually 40% higher than men. And when they do actually enter the labor market, there is a 71% pay difference for the same type of job. So it's already putting women in an unequal position to start with. The second one is the use of time dedicated to domestic care, and in particular the care of the family, the elderly, persons with disability, and minors. Women devote an average of 15 to 30% more time for the care of the home, which again puts women in a disadvantaged position, because I'm using my time to take care of the private sphere when I could be using the time to have a more public political career. And this puts us on the third issue, which is related, which is what we call in the investment dilemma, is that if I have to provide for my family, I have to care for my family, how do I make the decision of whether to go into a more public role in political life versus maintaining my family? So I'm the one who has to be making this choice. And the fourth one is the issue of unequal access to financing networks and donors, and this is already some research advancing the fact that women have a more difficulty accessing corporate financiers in the case of systems that allow for private funding of campaigns. And this is some of the baseline factors and issues that we are trying to understand. So the purpose of the project is to, we've all been talking the whole day about perceptions of electoral integrity. What we want to do with this project is to assess female and male candidates' perceptions about the obstacles and barriers what they face when they run their campaigns, to understand if they're aware of how political parties make decisions about who to give funding, and if there's a gender gap also in the distribution of funds within the party. Thirdly, to assess whether the more informal patterns of campaign financing tend to predominate to the detriment of the formal public financing rules. And finally, to assess differences in access to corporate and other private campaign donors. So what we did is we designed a survey online, casero, homemade, let's say, with 24 questions. Some included also some semi-structured and open-ended questions. And the questions dealt with what are the methods and calculation mechanisms to distribute funds within the party, to finance their campaigns, how are, questions about electoral expenses, how funding is decided within the party, is there formal accounting of the money coming in the campaign and leaving the campaign, is there any other informal strategies for fundraising that we need to know. And to administer the survey, we use what's called the snowball method, which we just share the questionnaire via social media using Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp. And we administered it between the 1st and the 31st of August for 1 month. And for that, we received 225 responses from female and male candidates from 19 countries. I will say that this is, as I said, like a home, more, I don't even know how to translate casero, but I guess. But talking with Pipa earlier today and also with Mona, they also suggested, and we're going to take a look at this competitive candidate survey. Did I say it right? Comparative candidate survey, which actually has a block of questions dealing with political financing, which is also hopefully going to help us contextualize some of the data that we've already collected. So very briefly, we had, as I said, 225 respondents, 85% were women, and we had 33 men answering, and 99% of them had been candidates in the past, most of them for the elected office of deputy at the local or federal level. As this is showing that 104 of them had run a deputy political campaign, and the rest included some Senate positions at the local level for the concejales, council members, mayors, and president at the local level, like mayor, yes. In terms of the money ceilings, lack of funding was identified by the respondents as the most important barrier for the development of the career, and some other factors included the lack of experience, even if confronted with other factors such as lack of political experience, lack of leadership skills training, or lack of confidence in potential electoral success. 115 out of the 225 pointed this out. And for the specific case of women, they included additional barriers such as favoritism of the party leadership toward their male counterparts, harassment and discrimination toward women as the two main factors, apart from money, access to money, to run their campaigns. This is a picture of some of the options, because we asked them, how do you find money for your campaigns? The majority said they did it with personal resources, and from that we added family resources or their own personal ones. And you see here the other options. We also asked if they had access to bank loans as a way to finance their campaigns, if they had support from donors, private donors, and donations, let's just say. Another question we asked is their perceptions on how, if there was clarity and it was, no opacity on the way that the party distributed the funding, and 41% said that there was no clarity in terms of how the party, they don't know what's the mechanism for the party to decide how to distribute funds, and there is a high perception of a gender gap in terms of how parties distribute the funds, with 49% saying that there is. Some preliminary findings, just to start closing. The first one, that women receive less money for their campaigns versus their male counterparts. Again, let's remember 85% of the respondents were women, almost 50% indicated there is a gap, and they also indicated they have less access to financing networks and to have to depend on personal or family funding for their campaigns. They also have more difficulty deciding what to do with their personal time. The majority of respondents, again, we're talking 85% women, admitted having domestic responsibilities, and that was especially the case for women. 90% of them said that they have difficulty in disposing of their personal time. The third one was that women have very little knowledge about how the party decides on how to spend public and private funding that comes within the party. And again, we start from the principle or the premise that opacity is bad for all candidates, but in the case of women, this is especially true. The fourth one is that women do not generally have access to bank loans or credit lines to finance their campaigns. Only a small group of women 5% said they had access to some form of credit to run their campaigns, and this is for systems that give the funding post-election, because there's variety within the region in terms of when the money is accessed. The fifth challenge is that women receive most of the leadership training within the parties, and this is something that's really bothering me, and I don't have an answer, but it's something that I guess we need to question more. The sixth one is that the women do not have access to funding networks or donors, which corresponds to our initial premise. They tend to rely mostly on family and personal funding to do their campaign. So some proposals for reform that we're already thinking of, and I'm super open to any suggestions and ideas and ways to make this research better and useful for actual political reform. The first one we're thinking about is incorporating protocols for the parties to really make transparent how they decide allocation of funding for candidacies, and you know, this is something that maybe the parties could do. Initially could be done voluntarily, but any other form of political reform that can help on this would help. The second one, to incorporate as part of the reform targeted funding for candidates to have access to money to cover like babysitters or other forms of additional help so they can go out and have a more political and public role. And this is an interesting case that we are kind of getting inspiration from, is the Canadian Elections Act that actually includes a disposition that provides funding for candidates to pay for babysitters or any other form of caretaking for their families so they can go out and run their campaigns. The third one is incorporating indirect public financing of campaigns in terms of access to media via percentage for female candidates in TV or radio time. This is only Brazil that has included something like this, so maybe other countries can also consider this reform. Number 4 is providing direct public financing for female candidates directly from the electoral management body, not via the political party, because we're finding again that we don't have a lot of information in terms of how parties distribute the money. So this could be a way to ensure that female politicians have some funding, and we could think of a mechanisms to ensure that this could be in a very transparent way. Fifth proposal is introducing modules on quota and parity laws and campaign financing laws on women's training programs to empower them in terms of knowing what are their rights, and so they can demand to the political party more benefits in terms of running their campaigns. Another one is the issue of accessing credit lines. So perhaps we could think of promoting forms of agreements between the banks and the female candidates so they can have credit lines to finance their campaigns. And the last two, the seventh one is the issue of revising and rethinking the whole issue of targeted funding for female training. How can we ensure that this could be done for both men and women within the party, and also training men on issues of equality and some other principles that can help normalize the presence of women in political office. And lastly, for the specific case for those countries that allow private or include private financing of campaigns, the possibility of legislating to allow political crowdfunding. We have some experiences in the region, including the US, where small amounts of money from different people have helped political campaigns, even to the point where they have renounced public funding for the campaign. So maybe this is something that we could think of for the particular case of women. I will leave it at this, and hopefully we can have more conversation later.
Thank you so much, Professor Bettil. Thank you for all of the conference were very strict on the time. So now I think we have time for questions and discussion. And as it's 6 o'clock, so half an hour over our time, I would like to organize like this, maybe 3 questions for each professor. Is it okay?
Like 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, let's think 3 or 4 maximum questions for each. So I would organize like that. Let us start with questions for Professor Mona. So maximum of 3 or 4, and then we ask the questions and you organize the answer in 5 minutes to answer. Okay, so questions for Professor Mona, please. What's your name?
My name is Fernanda Sosa. I'm from Chile, and I'm a visiting scholar at the BC Law School. Really, it's a question for any of you. They are also connected. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. My question is from my experience. I was in politics in Chile before moving to the US. And I really didn't have a lot of problems with financing. I know that's not normal, but immediately when I decided to run for a position there, I was running originally as a mayor in a big city. Everybody started offering me money to fund my campaign.
Buenísimo.
But I had the other problem, that the problem of the glass ceiling. I started to negotiate with some political parties, and they were all men in the higher positions, and nobody agreed to give me space to run. So at the end, I decided to start from the lowest part and run as a city councilor. And I got one of the best votes at that time. But it was hard to feel that glass ceiling immediately, going with having good surveys and everything with money, but nobody allowed me to run. But the other great problem as a woman that I felt being in politics was balancing life and work. That I think you all treat that problem. And I think it's not only a problem of needing more babysitters. I have 4 children, but they were not so little at that time. But the problem was more the idea that we, as women, we don't want to, we want a more balanced life. And generally politics, even if you're not in the middle of a campaign, meetings are at night, on weekends, and they're
and
not
in bars.
Yeah, so they're not necessarily they need to be at that time. But I think there is a problem of a cultural problem that we need to solve also, and we need to try to put as an agenda, try to change politics as the way of the politicians see, like it's normal to be in a meeting at 10 o'clock in the night on a weekday or during weekends. So many women that I tried to encourage to run for a positions, they told me, no, I don't want to have that kind of life. And it was really surprising. I think it's not surprising, the number that you, Carmen, indicated about women in judiciary. 28%. It's not a coincidence, because judiciary is very intellectually demanding, always also working hour demanding, but you know when your work starts and when it ends. And in politics, it's not the same. And that was like a comment that I don't know if it's really a question, but what do you think? I think one problem that we need to put in the agenda is how to manage work and family and work and life balance in politics.
Okay. More questions?
José Luis.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask to any of the ladies.
I think, can you say your name?
Yes, my name is Jose.
And
Jose
you are
Luis. I'm a student.
what?
A student
I should have.
from the Kennedy School. Yes.
Wonderful.
The three of you mentioned that these affirmative actions were thought as temporary measurements, and yet it seems that they haven't. That we still need them in our countries. My question is, what are the limits of these affirmative actions in terms of once the Congress women coming to power and they are in the Chamber of Deputies or in the Senate, when the distribution of the commissions happens, most of the political parties just give them, like commissions that are perceived as less important. So, for instance, these very important commissions, when they discuss the economic matters or when they design policy issues that are very important for the countries, most of the women are relegated in a sense. So what are the limits of these affirmative actions? And my second question, particularly for Carmen, do you think that these affirmative actions could be taken to other powers, for instance, the judiciary? Because I really, I understand that the reason behind affirmative actions in the Congress has to do a lot with political representation, because half of the population are women, and for sure you need them to be represented in these legislative bodies. But what about the judiciary? Do you think that it also, these affirmative actions should also apply in these cases?
Okay. You have a question there? What's your name, please?
Alejandra Barrios from Colombia, Misión de Observación Electoral. I'm going to ask in Spanish. My English is very bad. Maybe it's possible. Thank you.
Okay.
Creo que coincidimos en que, además de tener un techo de cristal, en la mayoría de los países de América Latina pareciera que tuviéramos un techo de hormigón. En Colombia ya es imposible poder avanzar en acciones afirmativas que permitan el acceso de la participación de la mujer en la política. Cada reforma se ha ido hundiendo. Creo que nos queda una opción y es por los partidos políticos. Es decir, no empezar por la mayor aspiración, que es lograr el 50% de la participación de las mujeres en el Congreso, sino tratar de empezar por las organizaciones políticas para tener una mayor representación que nos permita posteriormente avanzar a una mayor equidad, o por lo menos el 50% ya en los procesos electorales. ¿Qué experiencias exitosas conocen en ese sentido? Porque normalmente hemos empezado al revés. Es con las elecciones de grandes poderes y después llegamos a los partidos. Nosotros vamos a empezar es por los partidos, pero no tenemos referentes de experiencias que sean exitosas para poder adoptarlas como ejemplos.
We have to leave the room at 6:20, so we have 12 minutes. Does this side has any question? This side here, and we have the last question here. No? Oh, sure, Daniela.
Comment or question? Yes.
And then we go to the answers.
Okay, just in the same sense of Fernanda's comment, and thinking in this main idea of Carmen that the gender topic is a cultural topic, and then looking one of the slides of Betilde that are more congressmen than other public servants, because in the quotes in congressmen has been very, they have worked a lot in gender. I was thinking on how to improve education and culture in order to improve the gender equality, no? I don't know if you know the answer, maybe it's in the school, maybe it depends of the economic and social level, but I think we need not only a political or a legal solution, but also a cultural one.
Wonderful question,
I have
yes.
not been in politics as Fernanda, but never is late, I don't know.
That's a wonderful question. Talk about culture, how to do with the kids. Oh, so the last question over there, and then we go to the answers. Excuse me.
We do it tú primero.
You first?
Mismo orden.
Tilda is proposing the same order.
Thank you. Question, this could be for either panelists. Thank you very much for all the presentations were excellent. I think the three of you mentioned like a backlash in regards to women's participation. But what I heard was basically violence against women. But is there a more, say, institutional, structural backlash? I mean, are there reversing laws or advances in legislation? I mean, when you talk about backlash, is it what exactly is it about?
Okay, so let's do like that. We have 10 minutes, 3 minutes for each of you to say some comments. Beautiful questions. I like it very much, very deep. And then I have one minute to close. So let's start with Professor Mona. You can choose any question and see give your comments.
Okay.
Yeah, so I thank you for those different comments. I think there's some interrelated questions here. I think, but I think where I would want to start off is by saying that, you know, gender quotas, affirmative action, I mean, they're just a technical reform to the candidate selection process, right? But we put a lot of expectations that they're going to achieve, like, really, really complicated things, right? You know, the reasons for women's underrepresentation are multifaceted, right, and interactive, and you know, quotas are only, you know, changing one of those dimensions, and so I always worry about expecting, you know, too much, and then it's like, well, quotas have failed if they haven't changed everything. But I did want to maybe pick up on the question of parliamentary committees, and you know, I think this is a really good indicator. We could see, well, how far have quotas gone to change the gender distribution of power in politics? And you know, it's quite varied. I looked at this data in Mexico and Argentina, for example, and you see that Argentina, which had successful quotas much earlier, still has a very gender division of labor. Relatively, you know, proportionately, fewer women become committee presidents. There's gender distribution in terms of women are on particular committees and men are on others. Whereas in Mexico, it was quite reflective, right? Women were 30% of Congress, they were 30% of committee chairs. They were largely 30% of most other committees. And so there's some interesting variations. We just don't have you know, existing frameworks to explain, but I think that we see some really important variations that are worth looking at. I think also that, you know, maybe getting into these questions of backlash in space is that, you know, there's a lot of vested interest in keeping the status quo, right? Whether it's cultural, whether it's, you know, political parties. And I think this really gets at the crux of the issue. To give women more space, men have to give up some space, right? Like, there's a finite amount of space in politics. And this is, I think, gives rise to the very, I think, fraught, very emotional, very, you know, reactive behaviors we see towards including more women. And so I think it becomes, you know, really shows us that what we're asking with gender parity, what we're asking with affirmative action is really to change the face of politics. And there's a lot of people who don't want to see that change. And maybe I'll just end by saying, you know, in terms of political parties, and I didn't say this as much before, but, you know, political parties are really the crucial actor here. And what we are seeing with emerging data on violence is that most violence and harassment that women in politics face comes from their own colleagues. It comes from within their own political parties, right? Which shows us this isn't just you know, violence, which is about defeating another side, you know, political perspective or, you know, political competition. It's really about patriarchy and misogyny and keeping women out of those spaces. And I think this is something really, really troubling, and we really need to focus our attention on political parties as those actors that are in the way, but that can also help us move towards true gender equality in politics.
Well, very, very fast. About the balance between personal and work life. Yes, that is true. And I think we have to create this and to push this cultural change, because there were no women in Congress. Let's talk about Congress or the judiciary. I was the only female in the court. And when they elected me president, I told them, okay, but we are going to change all the ways we work here, starting from schedule. So we will start at 9 in the morning, which for some of you is late, for Mexican it's early. And we will have 1 hour for lunch, and then we will finish at 5. And I will turn the lights off, and I will demonstrate you that we will have economies, okay? We will save money. So 1 week later, I have a demonstration of all my colleagues in front of me and say, okay, Carmen, we need a favor. Don't call us to our homes, okay? And we need to have a secretary, female, of course, in our office, just in case something is needed. So they don't want to go home, okay? So it's not because of the presence of women there, it's because they are machos, okay? So we have to change that. And in Congress, they still want to have meetings at the bars, the canteens and bars in front of Congress. They are multi-billionaire because of the alcohol they sell, no? But now we have parity in both chambers of Congress. They are changing all this. And about the committees, it was very difficult to change that. But now in the Senate, they are chairing 50% of the commissions or committees, not in the House of Representatives. They couldn't do that. There are 500 representatives, here 128. So it's easier in a smaller body than a bigger one, but it is changing. But we have to do that, to push that. It's not easy. They don't want us there. Some of them like us as well. And so we have to change that. And finally, the backlash. I don't know about, well, there were some intentos, how is it? Tries. Intents at local level in Mexico to erase and to reverse the reforms, the parity at municipal level and local level, after a ruling of the Supreme Court that said that it was not compulsory to have parity at municipal level. So they said, okay, let's go back, no? But we women stopped that, okay? So we went before the Supreme Court with 36 new cases, and we are about to change that interpretation of the court to the opposite side. They will rule that it's compulsory, even if it is not in the Constitution, to have parity, to legislate parity at municipal level. So that's why I say, and I sustain, that we have to be there and push. If we are not there, nothing will change. We have to be there. And we are not begging. We are more than half of the population. It's not only in politics, it's in all spheres.
Thank you. Not only half of the population, usually half of the electorate, the electoral registries usually have 50% women and also 50% of the militancy of the party. So on the question of the backlash, I would say that that hasn't been the case in the law. Actually, we've moved, I don't know if you guys agree, forward in terms of now parity as a permanent form of increasing women's representation. However, the problem is what happens in practice rather than what the laws are saying. I will just address also the question on political, by Daniela and la alcaldesa, ¿fuiste alcaldesa? La concejala. Fernanda, on the culture. I mean, I think this is, like you were saying, it's multifaceted, but culture and education has a lot to do with how women are perceived as leaders, how women are perceived in the public political sphere. And on the Elections Canada option for helping with babysitting, es como una reparación. It's like a repair, patchwork type of measure. The state could think and governments could think of other types of public policies that help equate and put on an equal level the role men and women have in society. It starts with the family, it starts with the community, it starts with the school system in terms of how women or little girls and boys are given roles and opportunities, but it also has to do with some public policies that could be implemented, something as basic as the Nordic countries had done, such as paternity laws, that start to, distribute better the responsibilities in the care of the children, helping with the paid child care for both men and women, but this tends to benefit more women, and these are some of the public policies that could be implemented that go to the root of the problem. The helping to pay for babysitting is just something to kind of like help patchwork type of.
Oh, Alejandra, there are some good practices inside political parties in different countries. We can talk deeper about it, but protocols inside political parties, to reform their internal rules, and they decide to have, by instance, parity or a quota in their directorates and authorities of the internal parties, and judicial procedures inside the parties. So there are lots of experiences, and also the CIM, the Inter-American Commission of Women, is working on a model protocol for political parties. So I can share with you some experiences.
Okay.
Then, perdón.
So, 6:20, we are in time. I would like to say thank you for all the professors here. It was an amazing panel, very deep. Congratulations on your conference. You were very rich. Thank you so much, and I am very happy to be part of this panel and sharing this conversation. And say congratulations to the Clough Center on behalf of Professor Vlad and also Daniela for this beautiful conference, international conference, and say thank you for everybody and invite you for tomorrow. We should have a wonderful conference. So thank you so much and see you then. Bye-bye.